Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan. I direct Beyond the Choir. We partner with social justice organizations and movements, and we also run a Veterans Organizing Institute for veterans. We did the Vets versus Hate work last year, trying to push back on the discourse of last year. So in this work, you can imagine that I often get introduced as, hey, this is Jonathan. He's my friend who's an activist. He's a real live activist. And I'm introduced as an activist all the time, as probably a lot of us who do this work is. And I don't much like it, as Mika hinted. I usually let it go, to be honest, because I don't want to be rude or pedantic. But sometimes I do dig in and I say, I don't really like the label activist. Because it lets everyone else off the hook. And I want to say a little bit more about that. I really do think it does let everyone else off the hook and makes activism, makes collective action kind of about a particular kind of person. And there's a lot behind that. There's a lot in that. So let's look at the etymologies for just a minute. The word activism wasn't really with us for very long. It actually just it first appeared about 100 years ago, and it meant something totally different. It was Swedes who were advocating for Sweden to get involved with World War I. They were activists as opposed to pacifists. And then it didn't really take off it started becoming used in the 60s. It didn't really start becoming in common usage until the 70s and 80s. So what, right? There were people doing activism before that, right? There were people, they might have used a different word. There were the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the unionists, socialists, all kinds of different labels. So what, there's a new word called activism that brings it all together. Isn't it essentially the same thing? I think, no, it's not the same thing. I think that there's new meanings in the word activism that were not there beforehand and that are actually detrimental. So the words abolitionist, right? It carries a content. Abolitionist to end slavery. Suffragettes, it carries a content to, for women's equality. Unionists for workers' rights and workers' power. Now, each of these labels was polarizing, but the polarization framed a fight, a particular fight. Whereas now you have this idea of activism and of an activist, and we know through recent social psychological research that it actually is unpopular, that people that there's a popular negative reaction to the idea of activists and activism. And there's a whole story behind this. And it's not a fair story, right? But a story the right has told around this special kind of activism, this special kind of elite activist who's, in a college phase of their life, hippie, latte drinking, free loving, marijuana smoking, whatever. The stereotype, right? But what it does is it makes this kind of subcultural identity stand in between people who care about an issue and them taking action on that issue. In order to take action on the issue, they feel like they have to become this thing that they are not. And oftentimes in our groups, we reinforce this by becoming insular and kind of taking on this like clubhouse mentality. So we, the other thing I want to say about activism here is that, some activists then, it's not negative for everyone, right? Some people are attracted to this special kind of identity, and some people even become kind of attracted to the marginal aspects, right? And there's good reason for this. Like, we might have stood up when something, for justice, when there was something, when it was unpopular to do so, when there were social repercussions, and we can start to identify with the feelings of pride of being willing to do that. But that can become a holding pattern where we start to identify with the marginalization itself. I call this the story of the righteous few. And it's like we hold our candle in the wind, we're a voice crying out in the desert, and we start to become suspicious of success itself in the extreme version. Now, not all activists fall into this, but I will say that activism, the other special thing about activism, it's no coincidence that it has emerged over the past 40, 50 years as a category in the same era where I'm going to use the big neoliberalism word. Neoliberalism has restructured our lives. Individualism has risen, and civics has declined. Robert Putnam, Theda Skocpol talk about the decline of civic involvement and its consequences. In this context, activism has kind of emerged kind of like a hobby, right? It's like equivalent to being a theater person or a golfer. So it's like, oh, have fun at your protests on Saturday. I'm going to hit the golf course. You do you, I'll do me, right? And the obvious problem with this is that to take on entrenched power, and folks, this is the main political task at hand, right? To take on entrenched power, we need much more than a little niche that is contained that only a certain segment of the population identifies with. We need to break out of that. We need huge swaths of Americans getting involved, getting active. And there's good news. The good news is that we're at a low point right now, obviously with the current political situation. Actually, I want to back off from the good news for a second and say a little bit more about how we got here. I think that when you don't have that political force, this is part of how we got here, right? That with this declining civic involvement, especially the decline of labor unions, which remain one of the most important instruments that we have, but other community organizations, when you don't have that, we're making an inadequate demand on political power. And these organizations, like labor unions, like community organizations, imperfect as they were, provided the space for working people to have a voice in a political system that otherwise might not listen to them. And when you don't have that voice, Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. So you have a Democratic Party that has not been visibly fighting for working people, that a lot of people have been disillusioned with. A lot of people stayed home from the election, and a lot of people voted for somebody who exhibited the superficial trappings of outsiderness and promised to blow up a political establishment that people felt abandoned by. So this is part of the backdrop of this, we talk about it in Beyond the Choir, it's too long to go into here, but this profound kind of class-based insularity that has emerged in progressive movements, has manifested itself in this thing called activism, but also has affected the way we campaign in our organizations, the way we staff our organizations, et cetera. The opportunity. We have a tremendous opportunity right now, though obviously there's a threat, and we have to keep that ever before us. But the opportunity is, I've never seen in my lifetime, in my 4 decades of life, anywhere close to this level of people wanting to be involved, people wanting to crash the gates of this thing called activism and get involved and figure out how to make change. In Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I live, where this picture is taken, I could not leave my house for 3 weeks after the election without somebody stopping me. Literally, I didn't leave my house a single time for 3 weeks without somebody stopping me while I was out saying, what can I do? How can I get involved? One person said, I will work half-time instead of full-time and live on less if you can give me something meaningful to do. So in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, we have, I think, I'm going to brag a little bit, we've hit this right. We had a theory of change that a lot of people wanted to get involved, but Lancaster's not a bastion of progressivism. It's a conservative district. We thought that we needed to create a political opposition in this moment that was popular, that had a protest face, that would be in the town square, that maybe would occupy Representative Smucker's office, who is actually my second cousin once removed, and he blocked me on Twitter. That would do things like that. Small town politics are really fun. But it would also have an electoral strategy. But we also thought that both of those places, both of those kind of public faces were unfamiliar to most of the social base that we wanted to bring in this moment. And so we decided we had to create a civic face. So we called for an emergency community meeting. We got the buzz around. We identified a whole bunch of words we weren't going to use. Guess you might have guessed one of them, activist, activism. We don't use protester. We don't use a bunch of different words. And we kind of mimic community event aesthetics in our flyers. We got 300 people to our first community meeting. We got 400 to the next. Our largest one has been had 500 people. I'm gonna brag. We got 2,000 people out in Lancaster, more than 3 times the largest thing that has ever happened in Lancaster to protest the Muslim ban. We have been turning people out consistently by the hundreds. And part of it is we also named it Lancaster Stands Up. We put the town name at the beginning of it, right? We're having a problem of ownership right now because people will start offshoots like Lancaster Stands Up Against Racism Facebook group, unsanctioned by the leadership, but awesome problem to have. People are feeling ownership over this thing. People are identifying themselves as members of Lancaster Stands Up. So what's the point here? It's not to say Lancaster's doing everything right and y'all got it wrong. No, like lots of people are doing really exciting things right now. I think what we're experimenting with in Lancaster that I want to bring to kind of the civic tech community here is we're experimenting with a deeper ground game that is really onboarding people in a deeper way. And the feedback I've gotten a lot for years, I've worked with organizations that have this kind of like scaled model, right? We're gonna do distributed organizing and have low staff capacity and facilitate people at this kind of low level. People will say that this kind of organizing that we're doing doesn't scale. And to their credit, it's true. Our secret to success is we've got 5 really seasoned organizers who are putting in a lot of time and making this happen. But it does scale and it has to scale. It scales slower. We have to relearn these skills of democracy, basic skills like facilitation of meetings. It doesn't do everything, but it's actually essential to getting hundreds of people to come back to meetings. Scotch talks about how the skills of democracy have declined over the past 4 decades. And we really have to relearn that. And we're in this moment where we can, but it's gonna involve a big change in how we think about social change and our involvement in social change as organizers. It's not ours anymore, right? We have to unleash an unwieldy force that nobody will be in control of, but that all of us can participate in. Thank you.